Bonjour, good morning. My name is Hugh Williams, and I'm the national spokesperson for the Canadian Automobile Dealers Association. And we're here today in a joint press conference between the manufacturers and the dealers with a united message. Joining me on stage is Mr. Tim Royce, who is the President and CEO of the Canadian Automobile Dealers Association. We have Mr. Brian Kingston, who's the President and CEO of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. We have Mr. David Adams, who is the President and CEO of the Global Automakers of Canada. And we have Mr. Charles Bernard, who is the economist en chef, the lead economist for the Canadian Auto Dealers Association. We'll begin with remarks in English, and there'll be remarks in French as well. Over to you, Mr. Royce. Oh, Mr. Kingston, excuse me. Go ahead.
Thank you, Hugh. Good morning. My name is Brian Kingston. I'm the President and CEO of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. 1 year ago, the federal government finalized its zero-emission vehicle mandate, ZEV mandate, dictating an increasing ratio of ZEV vehicle sales in Canada. The targets established were ambitious and lacked evidence to support their feasibility. Instead of incorporating industry and expert input, the federal government relied on ill-conceived analysis from environmental groups posing as automotive experts. The CVMA indicated at the time that higher zero-emission vehicle sales levels could be achieved with favorable market conditions, stronger consumer purchase incentives, effective consumer education and awareness, widespread charging infrastructure, expanded grid capacity, and the development of a North American battery supply chain. Automakers have put their money where their mouth is. Since 2020, manufacturers have announced over $40 billion in job-creating investment in Canada. CVMA member companies are the only manufacturers in Canada currently operating the first full-scale EV battery plant and EV manufacturing facility, employing thousands of Canadians in well-paying jobs. Given the ambitious mandated targets established just 1 year ago, industry was shocked to learn this week that the federal zero-emission vehicle purchase incentive program has abruptly ended, creating chaos for consumers. Equally concerning is new data revealing that the pace of the charging infrastructure rollout is slowing. Both are critical preconditions to mass EV adoption. According to the federal government, the iZEV Consumer Purchase Program has exhausted its funding before the first year of mandated ZEV sales targets come into force in 2026. And the build-out of charging ports slowed in 2024 by 3,000 public ports compared to 2023. This is at a time when the government's own analysis is calling for an unprecedented acceleration in the pace of the charging infrastructure build-out. 100,000 public ports are required this year. There are 32,000 available today. At the same time, provincial governments in British Columbia and Quebec have established even more aggressive sales mandates, requiring 90% and 85% zero-emission vehicle sales by 2030, respectively. Both governments have recently pulled back on consumer purchase incentives and failed to build the necessary charging and electricity capacity. It should be obvious to everyone now that provincial and federally mandated zero-emission vehicle sales targets are no longer ambitious, but a complete fantasy. There is no pathway to 100% zero-emission vehicle sales in the next 10 years with the supports being provided to Canadians. Dictating what vehicles Canadians can and can't buy without providing them with the supports necessary to switch to electric is a made-in-Canada policy failure. Today, we are calling on provincial and federal governments to scrap the mandates. Thank you. Tim?
Thank you very much. Good morning. My name is Tim Royce. I'm the President of the Canadian Automobile Dealers Association. This decision by the federal government to end the EV incentives abruptly and way ahead of time is particularly frustrating for dealers who have done their part in building the infrastructure and resources required to support the EV transition. We are seeing governments at both the federal and provincial level decommitting from a difficult and costly process that they themselves instituted. There is obvious hypocrisy in imposing ambitious ZEV targets and affiliated penalties on the industry and consumers when the government is showing a clear lack of motivation and support to meet these goals. Dear Minister Guilbeault, this is your program. If you cannot secure adequate funding for it, get rid of it. I would now like to turn over to David Adams.
Thank you, Tim. My name is David Adams, President and CEO of Global Automakers of Canada. Let's be clear. We're not expecting sympathy for the auto manufacturers, and some may not have any sympathy for automobile dealers as well. But what we are talking about is an issue that is very problematic for dealers and fundamentally for Canadian consumers. Over the last 2 working days, we have witnessed complete lack of communication or miscommunication from Transport Canada concerning what appears to be a full wind down of the federal incentive for zero-emission vehicles program that has caused chaos and confusion amongst manufacturers, dealers, and as I mentioned, most of all, Canadian consumers. Because of this, that turn of events has led to the result that a number of consumers that may be expecting on receiving federal incentive will not receive that incentive. We are trying to work with federal officials to resolve these issues at the moment. Friday, Canadians were advised that the incentive program would expend all earmarked funds, as my colleagues have identified, by the ahead of the March 31st deadline, without the ability to recapitalize the program now that Parliament has been prorogued. The government could not, however, specify a date when the program would end, potentially leading to one consumer obtaining an incentive 1 hour and another consumer not being able to do so the next. With a monthly burn rate of $100 million, industry was advised last Friday afternoon that $70 million remained in the fund. Yesterday, less than 1 working day after being advised of the remaining $70 million, Canadians were abruptly told that the program was being paused, effective immediately, and no other incentives would be provided. We would argue even the use of paused is a disingenuous term, given that it seems highly likely that the country will head into an election once Parliament returns on March 24th, with absolutely no guarantee that any future government will continue to provide a purchase incentive. As a consequence, given the federal government has eliminated the much-needed purchase incentive to assist consumers in bridging the cost gap between a traditional vehicle and an electric vehicle, and has failed to continue to build out the charging infrastructure at a rate needed to support its own expected volumes of electric vehicle sales, as my colleague Mr. Kingston pointed out, it is now contingent on the federal government to reevaluate the fairness and efficacy of its ZEV mandate. Not only that, but the provinces such as BC and Quebec, which specifically referenced the presence of a federal incentive as part of the reason why it was winding down its own incentive, must also reevaluate their even more aggressive provincial sales mandate. In light of these circumstances, which seem to ensure that the federal ZEV targets for manufacturers set by governments will not be met, with significant consequences for manufacturers of not doing so, continuing to idealistically cling to ZEV mandates is neither reasonable nor fair to vehicle manufacturers, their dealers, and most of all, to Canadian consumers. Canadian consumers are the ones who ultimately drive this transition to electrification, or, conversely, suffer the consequences from ill-fated mandates. Thank you very much.
Yes, John, we'll now
Charles?
open up to questions from the media. And once again, on behalf of my colleagues, thank you very much.
Questions, comment down.
So I'm just wondering if you've been speaking to your union counterparts in Unifor or otherwise around these issues and what they've voiced and if they're voicing the same concerns.
I'll let Brian take that on.
Yeah, I don't want to speak for the unions, but the important thing about the concerns we're raising is we have a thriving auto manufacturing sector in this country, and as we raised concerns with Environment Canada with respect to the mandates, we consistently asked them to connect the zero-emission vehicle transition to our industrial strategy. The auto industry employs over 100,000 Canadians in well-paying, many of which are unionized jobs. And what we saw from the beginning was a total disconnect between the government's environmental policies and its desire to support and grow the automotive industry. So that's where our concern has come to. The industry is moving to electrification. That's a foregone conclusion. but it has to be done in an orderly way that protects these jobs and ideally grows the footprint here in Canada.
Tim?
If I could just add to that, quite a few of our members also have unionized personnel working at their dealerships, and it will be them that will be facing the ire and the madness and the frustration of the Canadian consumers with these recent decisions. Because let's make it very, very clear, our members are actually fronting for the Canadian government the money towards the consumer, because the EV purchase incentives are destined for the end consumer. And our members are performing a service on behalf of the government of Canada to administer and give that upfront when a customer purchases a vehicle, so that the government of Canada doesn't have to deal with hundreds of thousands of individual customers putting in an EV incentive claim, right? This is done at the dealership level. This is a service that our members are performing on behalf of the Canadian government. And now the Canadian government taking these decisions, the consumer, their anger and frustration will be directed at our members directly on the front lines, right? Including personnel, yes, that is also unionized at our stores.
If I might also add, Tim was relaying this morning that for the dealers, the entire interface, the web portal through which the dealers file the eligibility claims on behalf of consumers, has been shut down. So at this point, there's no way for dealers that have the paperwork ready to file on the behalf of their consumers to actually ensure that those claims are being paid out. So we need to find a way, working with Transport Canada, to ensure that all of those consumers that bought a vehicle, ordered a vehicle on the premise of receiving a rebate, actually get that rebate.
Follow-up question?
No, I think.
And if we have any questions online, si vous avez des questions en ligne, s'il vous plaît, utilisez la fonction lever la main. Use the raise hand function now if you would like to ask a question. No questions online?
Great. I'll conclude the conference by just highlighting the fact that this is all about the Canadian consumer. Ultimately, at the end of the day, a mandate that's out of step with the supports needed to make it successful will land heavily on consumers, not just in urban areas, but rural areas across Canada. And if we try to move a mandate too fast without the right supports, it's actually going to hurt the movement long-term towards EVs. This is a plan which we have to do together and not in an ideological bent. So merci beaucoup. Thank you for being here today. We'll be available for interviews later on today for those that are listening online. Thank you.